The crystal chandeliers sparkled above the grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel, where New York's elite had gathered for the annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala. Jonathan Wade stood at the podium, his silver hair perfectly styled, his custom Italian suit fitting like armor. At 58, he commanded every room he entered. His real estate empire stretched across 3 continents, his name synonymous with luxury hotels and exclusive properties. He was announcing a $10 million donation, his 3rd public contribution this year. The crowd applauded politely, phones capturing the moment for social media. Jonathan smiled, but it felt mechanical, rehearsed. He had perfected this smile over decades of business deals and public appearances. Halfway through his speech, something shifted. The bright light suddenly felt too intense, burning into his vision. His hands gripped the podium as a wave of nausea rolled through him. The faces in the audience blurred together like watercolors in rain. His carefully prepared words scattered from his mind. The room tilted sideways. Gasps echoed from the crowd. As Jonathan Wade, the man who never stumbled, never showed weakness, collapsed onto the polished stage. His body hit the floor with a sound that silenced 300 guests. Camera flashes exploded like fireworks. Within minutes, the video circulated across every news platform and social media site. The cold truth. Jonathan woke to white walls and the steady beep of medical equipment. The hospital room smelled of disinfectant and worry. Dr. Patricia Morrison sat beside his bed, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes carrying the weight of bad news. She spoke clearly, gently. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. 6 months, perhaps less. The tumor had spread quietly, aggressively. There were treatments that might extend his time slightly, but no cure existed for what lived inside him. Jonathan listened without emotion, as if she were discussing someone else's fate. He had faced hostile takeovers, economic crashes, brutal negotiations. This was simply another challenge, except this one came with no solution, no loophole, no amount of money that could change the outcome. His assistant Linda arrived within. The hour, her tablet already filled with messages from board members, investors, and journalists. Everyone wanted statements, updates, plans for succession. Jonathan waved her away. For the first time in 30 years, he did not care about quarterly reports or stock prices. The empty palace, the penthouse overlooked Central Park, 30 floors above the city that had made him rich. Jonathan stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching tiny people move through their lives below. His home was a masterpiece of modern design, all glass and steel and perfectly placed art pieces. It looked like a magazine spread. It felt like a mausoleum. He walked through rooms filled with expensive furniture that no one ever used. The dining table seated 12, but had not hosted a meal in 5 years. The grand piano in the corner collected dust, a purchase made because wealthy people owned pianos, not because anyone played. His bedroom was larger than most apartments, yet he slept alone every night, had done so for 20 years. Grace Bennett was arranging fresh flowers in the entrance hall when he arrived home, from the hospital. She was 42, though her warm brown eyes carried both kindness and the quiet sadness of someone who understood loss. She had worked in his home for 3 years, arriving each morning at 7 and leaving each evening at 6. She kept his, world orderly and clean. He had never truly looked at her before. Not really. She was simply part of the staff, efficient and invisible. But today, something changed. Maybe it was the diagnosis. Maybe it was exhaustion. When she asked if he needed anything, her voice carried genuine concern, not the practiced politeness of an employee. The question that broke him. Jonathan found himself in the kitchen, a room he rarely entered. Grace was preparing soup, moving with quiet efficiency. The smell of chicken and herbs filled the space, so different from the catered meals usually delivered to his door. He sat at the counter, surprising both of them. Grace glanced up but continued, cooking, sensing he needed normalcy, not fussing. After a long silence, Jonathan spoke. His voice came out rough, uncertain. He asked her a question that had been building since he woke in the hospital. When was the last time someone had touched him with affection? Not a handshake, not a professional pat on the shoulder. Real human warmth. He could not remember. The realization hit him harder than the diagnosis. Grace set down her wooden spoon. She looked at him directly, seeing past the billionaire facade, to the frightened man beneath. She walked around the counter and did something no one had done in years. She placed her hand on his shoulder, gentle but firm, a gesture of simple human connection. Jonathan felt something crack inside his chest. Not physical pain, but something deeper. 20 years of carefully constructed walls began to crumble. His eyes burned with tears he had not allowed himself to shed since his wife had left, taking their young son with her. He did not cry, not yet. But Grace's hand remained on his shoulder, steady and real. She did not offer empty comfort or awkward sympathy. She simply stayed present, bearing witness to his pain. The sleepless night that night, Jonathan could not sleep. He stood at his bedroom window, watching the city lights pulse like a heartbeat. His reflection stared back at him, a stranger wearing his face. When had he become this person? When had success replaced substance? When had he traded his humanity for empire building? He thought about his son Thomas, now 32 years old. They had not spoken in 7 years. The last conversation had been brief, cold, full of accusations Jonathan had deflected with money. He could not recall the last time he had told Thomas he loved him. His ex-wife Rebecca had tried to warn him years ago before she left. She had said he was disappearing into his work, becoming more machine than man. He had dismissed her concerns as emotional weakness. Now, facing the end of his life, he understood she had been trying to save him from exactly this moment. The city below continued its endless rhythm, indifferent to one man's reckoning. Somewhere in that vast landscape, people were falling in, love, laughing with friends, holding their children. Jonathan Wade, with all his billions, could not buy a single moment of what they possessed naturally. He pressed his hand against the cold glass. Tomorrow, he would begin dying. But tonight, for the first time in decades, he was beginning to understand what it meant to be alive. In her small apartment across town, Grace Bennett sat by her own window, thinking about the broken man in his empty palace. She had seen the fear in his eyes, recognized it from her own mirror 3 years ago when cancer had taken her husband, David. She knew that money and power meant nothing when facing the darkness. She whispered a quiet prayer, not religious but hopeful, that perhaps there was still time for Jonathan Wade to find what he had lost. Perhaps there was still time for him to discover that the greatest wealth was connection, compassion, and the courage to be vulnerable. The city lights flickered between them like scattered stars, 2 lonely souls unknowingly beginning a journey that would transform them both. Dawn broke softly over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Jonathan had not slept. He sat in his study, staring at a photograph he had not looked at in years. It showed a younger version of himself, arms wrapped around Rebecca, their 7-year-old son Thomas grinning between them. They looked happy. They looked like a family. Grace arrived at 7. As always. She found him still in yesterday's clothes, the photograph clutched in his hands. She set down her bag quietly and moved to the kitchen without a word. 20 minutes later, she returned with coffee and toast, placing the tray beside him. He looked up at her, exhaustion carved into his features. She met his gaze with steady compassion, then gently took the photograph from his trembling fingers. She studied it for a moment before speaking. "Your son has your eyes," she said softly. Jonathan nodded, unable to form words. The simple observation, delivered without judgment, broke something loose inside him. The weight of yesterday over the following days. Grace's presence became the only constant in Jonathan's unraveling world. She arrived each morning and stayed later each evening, not because he asked, but because she sensed he could not bear the silence alone. One evening, as rain drummed against the windows, Jonathan finally spoke about Rebecca. The words tumbled out like water from a broken dam. He told Grace how his marriage had crumbled slowly, killed by 70-hour work weeks and missed birthdays and promises he never kept. Rebecca had begged him to slow down, to remember that Thomas needed a father, not just a provider, but Jonathan had believed that building his empire was how he showed love. Each property acquired, each deal closed, was proof of his devotion. He could give them everything, security beyond measure. He had not understood that what they needed was simply him. The day Rebecca left, she had packed Thomas's clothes while their son cried. She had looked at Jonathan with eyes that held no anger, only sadness. "You chose this," she had said quietly. "You chose marble and steel over flesh and blood." Grace listened without interrupting. When he finished, she did not offer platitudes or assurances that he had done his best. Instead, she asked a single question that cut through his defenses. "Do you still have his number?" Jonathan looked away. Yes. But Thomas would not want to hear from him. Their last conversation, 7 years ago, had ended with his son's bitter words echoing through the phone. "You were never a father. You were just a bank account with my last name." Grace's expression remained gentle but firm. "Maybe he needs to know you are dying. Maybe he needs the chance to decide for himself." Shared scars. The next evening, Grace brought dinner from her own kitchen. Not catered luxury, but simple homemade lasagna that filled the penthouse with warmth. They ate together at the kitchen counter, and for the first time, Jonathan asked about her life. Grace spoke quietly about David, her husband of 15 years. He had been a school teacher, patient and kind, someone who found joy in small moments. They had never had much money, but their modest apartment had overflowed with laughter and music and love. Then came the diagnosis: lung cancer, aggressive and merciless. David had fought for 18 months, while Grace worked 3 jobs to cover the medical bills. She had held his hand through chemotherapy and radiation, through hope and despair, until the morning he took his last breath in their bedroom. That was 3 years ago. She had taken the job at Jonathan's penthouse because the hours were steady and the pay helped her rebuild. But more than that, she had taken it because staying busy kept the grief at bay. Jonathan listened, recognizing his own pain reflected in her words. They were both haunted by loss, by roads not taken, by the cruel truth that time could not be bargained with or bought. "I am sorry," he said, and meant it. Grace smiled sadly. "Me too. But David taught me something important. He showed me that love is not about how much time you have. It is about what you do with the time you are given." Small miracles. Something shifted between them after that night. Grace no longer felt like an employee. She became a presence, a companion. Someone who saw Jonathan not as a titan of industry, but simply as a man trying to make peace with his mortality. She convinced him to watch the sunrise from his balcony. He protested at first, claiming he had seen countless sunrises, but Grace insisted, and so they stood together in the pre-dawn chill, watching the sky transform from deep purple to blazing orange. Jonathan felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Wonder. He could not remember the last time he had stopped long enough to witness something beautiful without thinking about its monetary value. Grace taught him to cook, laughing gently when he burned scrambled eggs. She showed him how to fold laundry, how to water the neglected plants in his apartment, how to perform small acts of care that he had delegated away decades ago. They fell into an evening ritual, After dinner, they would sit in the living room, talking about everything and nothing. Grace shared stories about her childhood in a small town upstate, about her mother's garden and her father's terrible jokes. Jonathan found himself laughing, genuinely laughing for the first time in years. He told her about his own childhood, about growing up poor in Brooklyn, about the hunger that had driven him to build his empire. He had wanted to prove he was worth something, that he could rise above his circumstances. But somewhere along the way, proving his worth had consumed everything else. The phone call won week after their first real conversation. Jonathan finally gathered the courage to call Thomas. His hands shook as he dialed. The phone rang 4 times. Before his son answered, Thomas's voice was cold, guarded. "What do you want?" Jonathan's prepared speech evaporated. He simply said the truth. "I am dying. I have 6 months. I wanted you to know." Silence stretched across the line. Then Thomas spoke, his voice thick with emotions Jonathan could not decipher. "You think you can call after 7 years, and I will just forgive everything?" "No," Jonathan said quietly. "I do not expect forgiveness. I just wanted to hear your voice before I go." Thomas hung up without another word. The dial tone buzzed in Jonathan's ear like an accusation. He set the phone down carefully, his face blank. Grace had been standing in the doorway. She crossed the room and sat beside him. He tried to speak but could not. The dam inside him finally broke. Tears came in waves, years of suppressed grief and regret pouring out. He sobbed like a child, his body shaking with the force of emotions he had buried. Under decades of control, Grace wrapped her arms around him, holding him steady as he fell apart. She did not tell him it would be okay. She did not promise that Thomas would come around. She simply held him, her presence a quiet anchor in his storm. The turning point, when his tears finally subsided. Jonathan pulled back, embarrassed by his breakdown. Grace handed him a tissue, her expression unchanged. "That took courage," she said simply. He shook his head. "He hates me. I deserve it." "Maybe," Grace agreed. "But you tried. That matters." They sat together in the dimming light, the city glowing beyond the windows. Jonathan felt hollowed out, but somehow lighter, as if crying had released a pressure he had carried so long he had forgotten it was there. Grace stood to leave, but Jonathan caught her hand. "Please stay, just a little longer." She nodded and settled, back beside him. They did not speak, did not need to. The silence between them had transformed from empty to full, charged with understanding and the fragile beginning of something neither had expected to find. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm. Inside, 2 wounded souls sat together in the gathering dark, learning that sometimes the greatest gift you can give another person is simply to stay. Jonathan looked at Grace's hand in his, small and warm and real. For the first time since his diagnosis, he felt something other than fear. He felt grateful. Grateful that in his final chapter he had found someone who saw him, truly saw him, and chose to stay anyway. 3 weeks passed like falling leaves, each day carrying Jonathan closer to the inevitable. His body grew weaker, the cancer spreading its dark roots through him. Dr. Morrison adjusted his medications, managed his pain, but they both knew the countdown had begun. Grace had moved into one of the guest rooms, no longer just a housekeeper but a constant companion. She helped him dress when his hands trembled too much. She read to him when exhaustion made his eyes too heavy. She simply sat with him during the long nights when sleep would not come. On a Tuesday morning, the doorbell rang. Grace answered it, to find a tall man in his 30s standing in the hallway, his dark hair touched with early gray, his eyes unmistakably familiar. Thomas Wade had come home. Grace stepped aside, letting him enter. Thomas stood in the foyer, his jaw tight, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He looked around at the penthouse with an expression Grace could not quite read. resentment mixed with something softer, perhaps memory. "He is in the study," Grace said gently. "He will be glad to see you." Thomas nodded but did not move. After a moment, he spoke quietly. "Is he really dying?" "Yes," Grace confirmed. "He has maybe 3 months left, possibly less." Thomas swallowed hard. "Why did you call me?" "You left a message last week." Grace had indeed called, using the number from Jonathan's phone. She had not asked permission, had simply followed her instinct. That both men needed this chance, even if neither would admit it. "Because he loves you," Grace said simply. "And because you both deserve the chance to say what needs to be said." The bridge between them. Jonathan looked up when Thomas entered the study. For a long moment, father and son simply stared at each other across the divide of 7 silent years. Jonathan's face showed shock, hope, and fear all at once. Thomas broke the silence first. "You look terrible." Jonathan managed a weak smile. "Cancer will do that." Thomas moved closer, studying his father's gaunt features. The powerful man he remembered had become fragile, human, mortal. Something in Thomas's expression shifted, the hard anger softening into something more complicated. They talked for hours that day, not the surface conversations of their past, but real words, honest and painful. Thomas spoke about the loneliness of his childhood, about birthday parties his father missed, about school plays performed for an empty seat. He talked about watching his mother cry at night, about the divorce that had broken their family. Jonathan listened without defending himself. He acknowledged every hurt, every failure, every moment he had chosen work over his son. He did not ask for forgiveness, only understanding. "I thought providing for you was enough," Jonathan said, his voice hoarse. "I thought money could replace presence. I was wrong about everything that mattered." Thomas's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I needed a father, not a checkbook." "I know that now," Jonathan whispered. "I know it too late, but I know it." Grace brought them lunch, then dinner, leaving them to navigate their painful reconciliation. When Thomas finally left that evening, he hugged his father. It was brief, awkward, but real. He promised to return the next day. After Thomas left, Jonathan wept again. But these tears were different. They carried relief, gratitude, and the bittersweet joy of something lost, now partially found. The question, as weeks passed, Thomas visited daily. He brought photographs of his life, shared stories about his work as an architect, talked about the woman he was dating. Slowly, carefully, they began building something new from the ruins of their past. Grace watched their healing with quiet happiness. She saw Jonathan transform, saw him become more present even as his body failed. He laughed more, worried less, about legacy and more about connection. One evening, after Thomas had left, Jonathan asked Grace to join him on the balcony. The autumn air was cool, the city lights beginning to glow against the darkening sky. He held a small velvet box in his trembling hands. "Grace," he began, his voice unsteady. "These past 2 months with you have been the most alive I have felt in 20 years. You have shown me what it means to be human again." Grace started to speak, but he gently continued. "I am not asking you to carry my legacy. I am not offering you my fortune. I am asking you something far simpler and far more important." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band with a single modest diamond. It was nothing like the extravagant jewelry he could afford, and that was precisely the point. "Grace Bennett, will you marry me? Not because I am dying, but because for the first time in my life, I understand what love means. It means showing up. It means being present. It means choosing someone every day, not with money or gifts, but with time and attention and truth." Grace's eyes filled with tears. She had not expected this, had not allowed herself to hope for it. But looking at Jonathan, she saw not the billionaire or the dying man, but simply someone she had grown to love deeply. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." The wedding. They married 2 weeks later in the penthouse garden, a small rooftop. Space Grace had helped Jonathan rediscover and restore. Only a handful of people attended. Thomas stood as his father's best man, his presence the greatest gift Jonathan could have asked for. Grace's sister came from upstate, along with a few close friends. Dr. Morrison officiated, reading words about love and courage and making peace with mortality. Jonathan wore a simple suit. Grace wore a cream dress she had owned for years. There were no photographers, no press releases, no social media announcements. It was private, intimate, real. When Jonathan slipped the ring onto Grace's finger, his hands shook so badly that she had to steady them with her own. But his voice was clear when he spoke his vows. "I promise to love you with every day I have left. I promise to be present, to be honest, to be the man you helped me remember I could be." Grace's vows were equally simple. "I promise to walk beside you until the end. I promise that you will not face the darkness alone." They kissed softly, and Thomas wiped tears from his eyes. It was not a fairy tale wedding. It was something better. It was real. The weeks that followed were painful but precious. Jonathan's health declined rapidly, his body surrendering to the cancer's advance. But his spirit remained surprisingly strong, buoyed by the love that now surrounded him. Thomas visited every evening after work. He and Grace would sit with Jonathan, sharing meals, telling stories, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. Jonathan learned about his son's dreams, his struggles, his hopes for the future. They talked about Thomas's mother, about forgiveness, about the complexity of family. Grace cared for Jonathan with infinite patience. She helped him bathe when he grew too weak. She held water to his lips when drinking became difficult. She lay beside him at night, her hand in his, anchoring him to life. On good days, they would sit together watching the sunrise, Jonathan's favorite ritual. He would rest his head on her shoulder, and they would watch the city wake up, grateful for one more morning together. The last dawn, Jonathan died on a Thursday morning in early November, just as dawn was breaking. Grace was beside him, holding his hand, whispering that it was okay to let go. Thomas sat on his other side, tears streaming down his face, telling his father he loved him. Jonathan's last words were barely audible. "Thank you," he whispered, looking at Grace. "You taught me how to live." Then he closed his eyes and slipped away peacefully, a small smile on his lips. The monitors beeped their final alarm, but there was no panic, no drama, just a quiet passing, surrounded by love. The letter after the funeral. Grace discovered a letter in Jonathan's study, addressed to her in his shaky handwriting. She opened it with trembling hands. "My dearest Grace," it began, "I am writing this while I still have the strength, while my mind is still clear. I want you to know that meeting you was the greatest fortune of my life, worth more than every property I ever acquired, every deal I ever closed. I have instructed my lawyers to donate my entire estate to cancer research and children's hospitals. You will find this does not surprise you, but I have left you something more valuable than money. I have left you letters, one for each week we spent together, documenting how you transformed me from a hollow shell into a man who finally understood what mattered. These letters are my true legacy, not buildings or businesses, but proof that love, even discovered late, even in the shadow of death, is the only thing that makes us truly wealthy. You gave me the courage to face my son, to ask forgiveness, to become a father before it was too late. You gave me mornings that meant something, evenings filled with laughter, nights where I did not feel alone. You gave me a reason to die peacefully because I finally learned how to live. I love you, Grace. Thank you for staying. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for teaching me that the greatest act of courage is allowing yourself to be vulnerable, to be seen, to be loved. Forever grateful, Jonathan. Grace sat in the study, tears falling onto the paper, but her heart felt strangely full. She had lost him, yes, but she had also gained something irreplaceable. She had witnessed a transformation, had been part of a love story that proved it was never too late to change, never too late to become the person you were meant to be. Outside, the window. The sun rose over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of gold and hope. Grace held the letter close to her chest and smiled through her tears. She had given Jonathan time, but he had given her something equally precious. He had shown her that her capacity to love, to heal, to transform another person's life was a gift beyond measure. The city hummed with life below, full of people rushing to appointments, chasing success, building empires. Grace hoped that somewhere among them, someone would pause long enough to remember what truly mattered. Connection, compassion, the courage to love, even when time was short, even when the ending was certain. Because in the end, that was the only thing that lasted. Not buildings or bank accounts, but the moments when two souls recognized each other and chose to stay. Grace carefully folded the letter and placed it with the others Jonathan had left her. 52 letters, one for each week. They had shared. She would read them slowly, savoring each word, each memory. Thomas knocked on the door, entering quietly. "Mom asked me to check on you," he said. The word Mom came naturally now, a gift Grace had not expected. "I am okay," Grace said truthfully. "I am sad, but I am also grateful." Thomas nodded, understanding. "He changed my life too, because of you." They stood together at the window, watching the city wake up. Two people forever changed by a man who had finally learned, in his last chapter, what it meant to truly live. The end.